Hope you guys have gotten a little bit more coffee and you're ready to go. On behalf of the Harris Student Government and the entire Harris student body, I'm delighted to see so many of you here today and welcome you to Harris and the University of Chicago. My name is Sarah Boyle. I am a second-year MPP, a Pearson Fellow, and the President of Harris Student Government. This morning, I'm delighted to introduce our esteemed faculty panel. First, we have Professor Damon Jones, who is an Associate Professor at the Harris School of Public Policy. He conducts research at the intersection of three fields within economics: public finance, household finance, and behavioral economics. Professor Jones recently released a working paper on February 12th that examines the effect of unconditional cash transfers on labor markets using Alaska's permanent fund dividend, a payout from a diversified portfolio of invested oil reserve royalties established in 1982. At Harris, Professor Jones is known for teaching a practical course on household inequality and is a robust, engaging Twitter. Professor William Howell is the Sidney Stein Professor in American Politics at the Harris School of Public Policy and is also a professor at the Department of Political Science and the college. He has written widely on the separation of powers issues and the American political institutions, especially on the presidency. Professor Howell is the author, most recently, of Relic: How Our Constitution Undermines Effective Government and Why We Need a More Powerful Presidency. I was fortunate enough to hear Professor Howell speak on this book when I was admitted a student back in 2016. At Harris, Professor Howell is known for his Facebook Live chats on the Trump presidency with fellow Harris Associate Professor Anthony Fowler. Professor Ariel Kalil is a professor at the Harris School of Public Policy. She is a developmental psychologist who studies economic conditions, parenting, and child development. At Harris, Professor Kalil directs the Center for Human Potential and Public Policy and founded and co-directs the Behavioral and Insights Parenting Lab. Her current research examines the historical evolution of income-based gaps in parenting behavior and children's cognitive and non-cognitive skills. At Harris, Professor Kalil is known for taking on research assistance as part of her Behavioral and Insights Parenting Lab and is also the chair of the Dean's Diversity and Inclusion Planning Board. I could go on for a very long time telling you how awesome these professors are, but I think you'd rather hear from them than me. In the audience, we will have note cards going around, so if you do have questions for our professors here today, please pass them to the end of the row, and faculty will be picking those up. And if you could just join me in welcoming our faculty, we'll get going. So the first question for each of you is, like many Harris faculty, you have multiple projects going at one time. So if you could just please choose one research project, past, present, or future, that you are most excited about and want to share today. Professor Kalil?
Sure, I'll be happy to start. First of all, welcome everybody to Chicago. It's really a thrill to see so many students here. I will just tell you very briefly, in I think less than 2 minutes, about a project we just finished at the Behavioral Insights and Parenting Lab, where we focus on promoting parent engagement in children's cognitive development, primarily in the home environment. And what's very exciting to us about the work we do and the project we just finished is that we are integrating insights from behavioral science, or you may know it as behavioral economics, into the study of child development and parent behavior. And this is really carving out a new space that, again, kind of brings together different intellectual approaches. This is also very characteristic of how most faculty at the Harris School think and how the intellectual atmosphere at the University of Chicago works. But we're trying to see whether we can use very light-touch, low-cost approaches to scaffold the environment for low-income parents in particular, to help them follow through on their good intentions for interacting with their kids in ways that promote their kids' development. And if you want to think of a metaphor for what we're doing, you could think of the idea that we're trying to create a metaphorical Fitbit for parents and for low-income parents in particular, to close the kind of gaps that we see at the population level in cognitive skills and school readiness and socio-emotional skills that exist between low-income kids and their more economically advantaged counterparts. So we are designing and running large-scale randomized controlled trials in the city of Chicago in partnership with agencies like Head Start, where we meet and recruit families for our studies, and really testing out brand new ideas that draw from other fields about which we're very excited but have yet to be explored in the area in which I work. And we are finding very exciting results, publishing them, talking about them widely with our research peers, but also policymakers and people who design programs that interact with low-income families.
Professor Howell?
Well, welcome everybody. Sun has come out. Here we are. So I have a couple of hats that I wear. I'm the chair of the political science department now. The faculty director of something called the Civic Leadership Academy, which brings in about 30 civic leaders from the nonprofit and government sectors here in Chicago. It runs a 6-month program, and that's a Civic Leadership Academy is something that's transitioning over to the Harris School. It's a really exciting initiative. And I'm a faculty member in the Harris School as well. And as a political scientist, I spend a lot of time thinking about political institutions, the design of political institutions, the ways in which power operates, and the conditions under which we see policy change, and the conditions under which we decide they do not. And so things that I'm interested in, I've got a bunch of papers that I'm working on, but you mentioned the book, which came out a little over a year ago, this book called Relic. And the tail end of the book, you may have heard, right? It ends with, and why we need a more powerful presidency. And that was written when the world made sense. And now there's more to say. And so we're working, much the co-author of mine and I, Terry Moe, he's a professor out at Stanford, and we're reflecting a lot, we're writing a follow-up book to it, reflecting a lot on the relationship between government dysfunction and populism, and the ways in which institutional reforms can lead to, we want to argue, a more effective government, by which we mean a set of institutions that allow elected officials and that channel their incentives to advance meaningful policy change that actually solves problems. Right? This is a story not so much about representation of interest as it is about how do you attend to actual problems and design institutions in ways that allow and encourage political actors to do so. And so we're going to double down on the story about the presidency playing, as an institution, a crucial role in problem solving, and argue that it's misguided to think that the thing that one should do in an era of populism and general dysfunction is to make it even more difficult to sort of guard and correct and check executive authority, because in many ways, this is a big theme out of the progressive movement, which was, at the turn of the 20th century, which was the most sustained effort, social movement in our nation's history to try to solve problems associated with immigration and the rise of the United States on the world stage and massive changes in the economic sector. They too saw the presidency playing a key role, and we want to argue so too now. And it's really misguided to reason from the president that you love, just as it's misguided to reason from the president you hate. And we need to think institutionally about how we attend to the challenges associated with populism. So those are things are sort of a flavor of the kinds of questions that I'm trying to grapple with.
Thank you, Professor Jones.
Well, I'd also like to welcome everyone here this morning. It's good to see everyone. We're really excited about your visit. So there's a project that I've been working on for a number of years. It's called the Illinois Workplace Wellness Study. So I have some co-authors at the University of Illinois, and we've set up this big randomized control trial, which you'll hear plenty about that method when you come here in the fall. And so we've been studying the effects of workplace wellness programs, which are basically policies designed by employers to incentivize their employees to take steps to improve their health. And so the reason why I'm so excited about that project is that we've been in the field basically setting up and implementing this study for a number of years. We've been writing a lot of grant proposals, and that's all perfectly fun and exciting. But now we get to produce data and analyze the results. So we just released our first set of results maybe a month or two ago. And we just have a lot of questions lined up that we'll be answering. We want to know, do these programs lower people's spending on health care? Do they produce measurable improvements in health? Do they change the likelihood of people staying with their employer? And how do people interact with their coworkers when they're deciding whether to make use of these programs or not? And so we have basically more questions than we can answer, or we have enough data and questions that we're going to be busy for a long time. And so that's always exciting when you basically line something up and now you're ready to just actually, write up the results and release the results. So
Great. And I take it you'll need some research assistance for that.
Research assistance and retweets.
And retweets. There we go. Okay, retweets. Right. So all of you are doing academic research. Some of you are going on the verge of retweeting, and that's how you're getting your message out. But I just want to know, how does your academic research relate to the real world? I'm leaving it. Do you want to start?
Sure, I'm happy to start. So, in our lab, we're really interested in conducting research that has applications to the real world. I mean, that's just sort of fundamental to how we think about what we do. But as I said, we are now, our kind of bread and butter is designing and testing randomized controlled trials. We always work with the practitioners, the people in the nonprofit agencies, the policymakers, the decision makers in the real world at every stage of the design of those experiments. And that's really critical, I think, to our ability to hope to make an impact, because we don't want to be sitting over there in the Harris School designing some intervention that is got sort of only theoretical interest to us. And, the results may be, super interesting, but only our academic peers will ever make use of them. So we make sure that we do that and also do something that's practically important to the people whose lives we hope to affect. And as I said, for us, that involves sitting down with the public stakeholders from the very beginning to make sure that we've got the question right, or at least maybe we can ask multiple questions and we need to make sure we know what their question is. To making sure that we have access to the institutions where we need to interact with families to do the kind of measurement that we need to do. We need to measure parent behavior. We need to survey parents. We need to test kids. We need to interview teachers and other relevant stakeholders. Like, we, again, can't just sit over in our office and sort of dream about the optimal scenario for how all that's going to happen. So we work, again, very closely with the public-facing part of, our research projects at every stage. And then when we're done, so Damon was just talking about the excitement of getting your results and, having your paper released by the NBER and other academic peers reading about it on Twitter. We try to do all that too. But we also spend a lot of time sharing our results with those same stakeholders whom I described. So we have public forums where we invite all our stakeholders to hear what we've learned. We ask them what they think of our results. We ask them to respond so we can iterate and inform the next project, etc. Because ultimately we want to design scalable, practical interventions that these stakeholders can take up for themselves in the future. And in order for them to want what we produce, they have to be a part of the design and decision-making from the beginning.
So I come at this a little bit differently in that where a political scientist begins to think about the relevance of the real world is to say, you've identified a really good policy, and you've done the hard work associated with figuring out what constitutes the optimal intervention in some policy domain. But the translation of that really good idea into actual law is hardly seamless. It's quite the opposite, in fact. There are all kinds of vested interests and organized entities and legislative processes that are explicitly and implicitly designed to subvert good ideas and to redirect good ideas. And so then the challenge is, how do you think about when we can get good ideas to become law? And when, in an era of pervasive gridlock, in an era of heightened polarization between the two major parties, an era of separation of powers where you have Congress stepping up, working in ways that are uncoordinated from the courts, working in ways that are uncoordinated from the bureaucracy, and then you've got that stacked on top of a federalist structure. How do we begin to make sense of affecting meaningful change when ultimately, right, you want the law and you want to see it adequately implemented? But what we need is more than just a good idea about what the policy is. And so political scientists then spend a lot of time thinking about what that policymaking processes look like. And a thing that we do, I'll just put a shout out to a program that we run at the Harris School, which is the Project on Political Reform, is to think about ways of bringing stakeholders across the political divide to talk about hard issues. We do this through a series of dinners, a series of conferences, where we bring people on the left and the right to come to talk about something like immigration. We try to structure conversations that are meaningful there. We bring together stakeholders in government to think about what kinds of institutional reforms they would get behind across the political divide in order to make our government work better. So it's in those sorts of ways that political scientists tend to engage the real world.
Mr. Jones?
Yes, I would just say, thinking about this question, one of the things that keeps my research grounded is actually being in a school of public policy. So, I was trained as an economist, and in the econ department or in most academic departments, you're kind of allowed to ask questions about what interests you, and you can ask very theoretical and abstract questions about human behavior if you're a social scientist. And at the Harris School, in teaching classes and interacting with the students and other faculty, we're kind of disciplined to think about why the question we're asking, why it matters. And so that gives me a lot of opportunity to look at how my research intersects with the quote-unquote real world. So sometimes the world is surreal and I don't know what's going on. But, we have, so I'll give you two examples. One is that I do research on tax policy, and I teach a class on tax policy where the students, for half the class, the students are volunteer tax preparers with a local nonprofit, the Center for Economic Progress. And then the other half, we do lectures on inequality and tax policy and household finance. And so in that respect, the students are getting like hands-on work in a service learning environment, helping people to prepare their taxes for free. And then that informs what we learn in the classroom. And so that, puts our learning right there in the field. The second thing is, another example I'll point out is, last year, the students in one of the student organizations, MIPS, they brought out the mayor of Stockton, California. His name is Michael Tubbs. And he came to speak with the students, and this is someone that I know and I've talked with before. And so he came and spoke with students, and he was very open to their ideas about policy. And now he is currently trying to pilot basically a basic income project in the city of Stockton, California. And that dovetails with some research I've been doing on, what was mentioned in Alaska, which is also related to the effects of a basic income policy. And so I've gotten to work with him to, think through what kind of questions they could ask in their pilot. And so that's another exciting example of how, actual policymakers can be informed by the types of research that we do.
Great. So I've got one last question for you guys before we start taking student questions for today. So you've all shared with us the ways in which you interact with the real world. So this question is going to be twofold for you. What do you think is the most pressing issue facing policy, and how can students who are coming to Harris for a 2-year master's program engage in the issues? The pressing policy issue could be something other than what your actual research is on, if you'd like.
Well, let's switch up.
Yeah, switch it up.
So I don't think there is one definitive, most pressing policy issue. And throughout the course of the day, the number of new headlines that hit suggests that there's multiple things that we have to keep in mind at the same time. One thing I think of that is a very important policy issue is thinking about inequality. And there are a lot of different ways that you can think about inequality across different types of groups, across different countries, within the same country over time. And I think that there's a lot of room for policy problem solving in that area. And as far as students getting engaged in that, when they're spending their 2 years here, I think that you have a remarkable opportunity to learn about the extent to which inequality exists, the different ways in which it's manifested, and how we accurately can measure it, how we can describe it, and what the most innovative options are at your disposal to try to address that. So I don't think that by the time you leave Harris School you will have eliminated inequality, but you will have a lot of tools at your disposal to think very deeply about how do you characterize it and what are the trade-offs in different approaches to trying to reduce inequality.
So,
Yeah.
You go. So I would, I guess the way I would answer this question is to a really interesting and important puzzle as faculty and as students is to think about the intersection between evidence and policy. And as Will Howell just alluded, that the path from research evidence to some law or public policy is far from seamless and straightforward. In the classes I teach and the work I do, we think hard about what kind of evidence do we need. I'm sure you've all observed the rise of the randomized controlled trial in areas where, up until quite recently, that was not the modal empirical method. So we, in my own courses, for example, we try to read as widely as possible among those studies, but we also talk about what are the limitations of that kind of work. We don't just go from an experiment to a public policy. There's just as many limitations in randomized field trials as there are in descriptive work. And quite frankly, so public policy that eventually, comes to pass is based on a variety of different kinds of evidence and a variety of different kinds of interpretations of the existing evidence. And I think it's just a super important puzzle and intellectual challenge and practical problem and mission of Harris School students to really grapple with that problem. I've already forgotten, was there a second part, or was that the second part?
You've got it.
I got it. Okay.
Yeah, I've already forgotten the question.
Yeah.
But I have things to say, so I can do that. Yeah. I think if I were to pick one, it's not an area I've ever done any work in, but I would, if I could force to pick, I'd pick climate change. And there are profound measurement challenges associated with work on climate change, just as there are profound challenges associated with attribution. What are the causes of climate change? And a lot of what it means to come to the Harris School is to figure out how you do that hard measurement and attribution work. And to continue to blow this horn that I've been blowing, it is quintessentially a governance challenge, climate change. When you think about a problem that is unfolding very slowly, that is global in nature, if we're going to get traction on a problem like this, we need to think about how you effectively design institutions that are cross-national in this instance, that will tie people's hands, not just in this moment, but over long periods of time, in order to grapple with a problem at that scale. In many ways, the most profound challenges that we face in attending to it are governance in nature, which is why a significant portion then of what it means to get a Harris School education is to think about the political economy of policymaking.
Great. So for the beginning of our student questions, you've clearly inspired the people in the room because they're all asking how to engage further with you. So folding in two questions here, I've got how do you involve students in your research and professional opportunities, whether that's conferences or symposiums, and adding to that, what are the skills you look for in research assistants?
Well, I don't mind taking that because I have a lot of experience working with students. So in our lab, for example, we probably have at least 20 MPP students working at the moment in our lab on our research projects, doing various things, an additional 20 undergraduates, plus PhD students and postdocs. So I run the kind of research enterprise where there's plenty of room for interested students to participate. And not only do they do the research, they do get to participate in the exciting part of it. So we bring students downtown to the mayor's office when we go to talk to them about our work. We've got students now who are putting together proposals for the Clinton Global Initiative, which is coming up here on campus. So, we view participating in research as an MPP student as a great enhancement to the coursework that you take. super relevant if you're going to go on to have a research career with this degree, and I would say critical if you ultimately decide you want to get a PhD or further graduate training.
Do we need to all talk
No.
for each one? I thought that was great. I mean,
Well, I guess one thing I'll add is that there are, at different times I have needs for, a lot of artists to help me with collecting data. It's especially important, or in the special advantages, those who can actually help me with analysis on the data. So while you're taking your classes where you're learning the statistical tools, those come in handy a lot for the type of research I do. The second thing is, in the class I have, which is more of like the practicum, the service learning class, the students there are working with a local nonprofit through the course of the class, but there seems to be a lot of interest in this type of work. And so another way to engage with students is to think about how we might grow participation in those types of activities as volunteer tax preparation, and what can happen at the Harris School to expand our interaction with the organizations that we work with in that respect.
Right, so a follow-up for you, Professor Jones. What is your Twitter handle? Or if any of you would like to share your
My
Twitter
Twitter
handles, your Instagram, Professor
Well,
Kalil?
Yeah.
My Twitter handle is actually a riddle. It is at Nomad J1S.
Okay.
So you have to think about that.
I didn't think about that.
I think we should do that collectively.
Right, so Professor Howell, I'm going to ask you this. What can be done to reduce the heightened polarization of our current political climate? I feel like you're writing a book on it. I feel like you might have a good answer.
I don't know. So we're actually doing a conference in about a month. We're bringing in a bunch of scholars who are going to, they're faculty here and from around the country, and a cross-section of political practitioners across the political divide to think about institutional reforms that we can go in and attend to this huge problem of polarization, which has been documented in all kinds of ways. So there's lots of work done by members of our own faculty who track first the incidence of polarization. And what you see is that the Democratic Party becoming slightly more liberal over the last 40 years, and the Republican Party becoming dramatically more conservative over the last 40 years within Congress, and then a lot of work being done to track whether or not, and the extent to which that relates to changes in public opinion. Is it about that? Is it changes in how we elect people, right? Is it about primaries? Is it about money in politics? Is it about gerrymandering? Short answer on that is no, it's not about gerrymandering. There's a lot of work actually being done. So rather than offer one particular solution, because lots of people have small ideas of interventions, there's a tremendous amount of work being done investigating sort of the collection of reforms that would be needed in order to alleviate the incidence of polarization that we actually observe today.
Great. Okay, so how has the current dialogue on social justice, for example, #MeToo, historic racial depression, aggression against undocumented immigrants, affect how you frame your research and discussion in the classroom? And any of you can choose to answer that one today.
I'll give a shot.
Okay.
I'll give a shot. This is, in this particular age, I take great comfort, actually, in having the opportunity to regularly spend most of my professional life interacting with people who are younger than me and who are more energetic and more forward-looking and vital and vibrant. I was on leave, not this year, but last year, and when Trump was elected, my head exploded. And I studied the presidency. That's my main thing to do, right? And as I suspect many people in the room, it was just like, what's happening in the world? And so I came back to teach an undergraduate course on the presidency. It's a course I've taught at length. And to create, there's a way in which, in my experience at this university, it's not something that one has to attend to delicately. You can create a space that people enter into, and they enter into it fully. And it was, for me, in the aftermath of that election, to spend a quarter interacting, these were with undergraduates, the same experience with graduate students, to try to make sense of really hard and emotionally laden issues in ways that are respectful, but also substantive. This was not a quarter spent people, chanting slogans at all. It was about a set of people who were committed and concerned, and coming from it, their commitment and concern was coming from lots of different places. But this is a way in which I think the University of Chicago really thrives. It happened really quite organically. It wasn't a matter of kind of careful design or negotiation, as it was a sense of urgency that was jointly felt by the students, and we entered into that space. So, yeah, there's no little trick that one does.
I could just add very briefly, I mean, these questions of social justice and opportunity and human potential are really fundamental to what I study and what I teach. So I study predominantly low-income families, and I am interested in the role of both private and public support that supports the human potential of low-income kids. And I was also on leave last year, and so I'm back in the classroom teaching this year, and had to redo all my slides, because what we do now as a country to support the well-being of low-income families is completely different from what our federal government was doing the last time I taught this class. And so I think it's super important that we engage. My mission is to engage my students in understanding what is the role of income support in child development. What happens when the social safety net expands and contracts? What happens when we both provide but remove supports for working families in the low-wage labor market? And how does that affect the human capital development of the next generation? So I feel like we're doing this in real time in my class in this year in particular, and it's both exciting but daunting, and provides lots of opportunity for good discussion.
Yeah, I would just briefly, two things I would say. There's a lot of ways in which the current climate has affected our research and what we do and how to teach. So two quick examples would be in the class that I teach, where the students are working as volunteer tax preparers. I had been focusing on tax policy and household finance, and I expanded the discussion of inequality in that class. And so, for example, I taught a lot more about the gender wage gap, for example, and that was a timely topic to bring into discussion. And so that to me was very exciting to engage with the students about. And the second thing is, relatedly, in the economics profession, there's been a lot of attention turned to. There's been a couple things, but in particular, how women are treated in the profession of economics, or the poor treatment of women in economics in different ways. And so this has also been an interesting and exciting time for economists, because there have been a lot of, I think, overdue discussions about women in economics that are now being given much more focus than they have been.
Great. Thank you. So some of you obviously came from different institutions before you came to Harris, where you're happily employed and enjoying the Harris community. So how are these classes at Harris and the programs at Harris different from other programs in the fields, whether that's an MPP in another school or also another degree completely, such as a poli-sci degree, a economics degree, sociology, MBA, etc.?
If you want to get the trash thing.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to trash Harvard. We can. Here's the thing. I taught, before coming here, I was teaching at Harvard, and I would teach this class on the presidency. And regularly, on the first day of class, the hand would go up, yes, and the question that was asked me, and I developed a response to it, was, so which presidential administrations have you served in, right? And the answer, I never served in a presidential administration, right? That's what they want to know, right? How do I get into the corridors of power? And I've never been asked that here, and don't you dare. We've got a good run happening here. And because the students who come here, they care about first-order questions about power and institutional design and the possibilities of policymaking, and they want to get in at that level, and which is a much more interesting space to occupy than the space that says, how is this going to get me into the place that I'm expecting served, which is why I'm willing to stand for you. So, there.
Harris School is that I'm teaching an elective, and we're talking about inequality, tax policy, and household finance. And it's not the most technical class that I teach, but I'm able to go back and forth between high level and then more technical details, and the students don't shy away from that. And so I think that regardless of your background in terms of like quantitative rigor or statistical or econometrics, I think that people are willing to be pushed in that dimension, and that allows you, you obviously don't want to stay in that place, but sometimes you have to go there, and that allows you that ability to do that when you need to do it.
Right, so a fill-in-the-blank question. The most successful students at Harris are those who?
Get after it.
Go to office hours.
Darn it. Yeah, engage, talk, raise your hand, participate, ask questions, get involved with your peers. I mean, there are just like the most amazing student groups in the Harris School who do fabulously amazing things, bring in fabulous public speakers, think really creatively about events and opportunities. I think it would be, to me, I would love to be a part of all that. And I think I would definitely think that's a key role in both your experience and your success in the program.
Okay. And do you have any interesting books or research paper recommendations for us to check out before they walk in the door? Do not promote your own, and then something else.
Okay, so a book that I think I would recommend to you is Evicted by Matt Desmond, sociologist. Has anybody read it? Oh my God, okay, so there you go. Ask the person next to you what they thought of it. Great new read by, I think, the most talented young sociologist working in the country right now about the precarious nature of the housing market in urban America and how that redounds to family well-being and child development, and primarily a qualitative approach to the study of that question, but someone who also is well-versed in quantitative research. It's won like every prize in the universe in the past year. So that's what I would say.
I'd make a pitch for a book by Jeff Tulis. He is an actual graduate of University of Chicago. He got a PhD here, and he just came back and gave a presentation at the Seminary Co-op, which is the best academic bookstore in the country. And it's called Legacies of Losing in American Politics. And what he does is he thinks through the ways in which Goldwater's defeat in '64, Johnson's impeachment, go back to 1865, right? And the Anti-Federalists losing in their effort to stop the ratification of the Constitution, all laid a groundwork for the eventual rise of conservatism in American politics, the deconstruction of Reconstruction in the South in the aftermath of the Civil War, and in the case of the Anti-Federalists, a reservoir of arguments that have been available to people who want to argue on behalf of states' rights that were not clearly the intention of the actual founders. It's just incredibly rich.
I have a completely objective recommendation, a book written by one of our colleagues at the School of Social Service Administration down the street from the Harris School. It's called Ghost in the Schoolyards, Racism and School Closings on Chicago's South Side by Eve Ewing. So the reason why I would recommend this book is because it's about stuff that's happening here in Chicago, and it goes into the history of policy, race, and segregation here in Chicago, and you will be, when you come to the Harris School, spoiler alert, you will be going to school here in Chicago. So you ought to know what goes on here in Chicago, and particularly in the South Side, and historically what policies here in the city.
Great. Right, so last question is more of, do you have any advice or closing remarks for our potential incoming students?
I would say, while you're here on campus, we have a conflict of interest. We get paid by the university to So talk to the students is what I would say. So the students are the people who are in a position that you're potentially going to be in, and ask the students to honestly tell you about their experience.
Go to the seminary co-op. I go and buy those 3 books. It's just up the road. That's one. The other thing is, I would say that a great resource is this larger city. It's in really profound ways. It's profound, one, because it's just a great city. It's a great city to live in. But it also, as a resource, it's a deeply challenged city. And there are profound concerns about inequality and educational access and race that play out blocks away from here. And if you care about public policy and about making this world a better place, as you wouldn't be in this room if you didn't, being in this kind of environment couldn't be more vital. And so recognizing not just the Harris School on its own, but how it's situated within this world-class university, which is also situated within this world-class and deeply troubled city, is, to my mind, what makes this such a compelling place to be.
Well, mine is going to sound sort of not as grand a vision as my colleagues, but actually you have the great fortune to have beautiful weather this weekend, which is not always true of the first weekend in March in Chicago. I would just spend an hour when you find it walking around campus. Just feeling, it's a beautiful, beautiful campus. It's very somber and profound experience if this is your first visit here, to just walk around and look at the Gothic architecture and just feel it. Just get a sense of, wow, I could spend my next 2 years here, and wouldn't that be amazing?
Would you say that if it were 2 days ago when the weather was really bad? You would switch it up, wouldn't you?
I might say
don't go outside.
Well, I would say go to the seminary for 2 hours, because Will's absolutely right. It's fabulous, and I would say go next door to the adjacent coffee shop next to the bookstore, which is also just really, truly the greatest coffee in Chicago. So, but you can do that also, even though the sun is out. Now you can do both things.
And you can sit outside. All right, well, thank you, everybody, and thank you for your questions. After this, we're going to head back to the cloister. Oh, Jenny's going to make an announcement on that. There we go, then. Anyway, if you please join me in thanking our faculty council today.